comrades, friends, those of you here for the first time, welcome. Today we will hear two speeches on the question of class unionism, the May Day tradition, and the political phenomenon of opportunism, which has its latest manifestation in the election of Zoran Mamdani as New York City mayor, as the latest poster boy of this duplicitous social trend. We will close with questions. Those attending online who want to get more involved can find our newspaper, our theoretical magazine, and our contact information at internationalcommunistparty.org. Our party, the International Communist Party, is a small party and a very old one. We trace our origins to the revolutionary current that emerged within the crisis of the First World War, when the collapse of the Second International revealed the bankruptcy of opportunist social democracy. In 1914, as the parties of the Second International betrayed the working class by voting for war credits and aligning with their national bourgeoisies, the communist left upheld the only consistent proletarian position: opposition to imperialist war and the call for revolutionary defeatism. Lenin insisted that war was not an accident, but the inevitable result of capitalism in its imperialist stage, and that the task of the proletariat was not to defend the nation, but to turn the war into civil war against its own ruling class. This position found its confirmation as the war deepened into social catastrophe. Millions of workers and soldiers broke with the chauvinist parties and rallied to those who had told the truth, culminating in the overthrow of the bourgeois state in Russia. The current that would become the International Communist Party drew the lessons of every defeat that followed, in Germany, in Hungary, in Italy, in Spain, in France. Its insistence was this: imperialism is not a policy that can be reformed. It is the highest stage of capitalism. As capitalism develops, the merging of industrial and banking capital into finance capital produces monopolies whose competition over resources and markets makes war inevitable. Fascism is not an aberration. It is the political form capitalism assumes in crisis. Democracy serves the same economic system under different conditions. In both cases, the function is the same: to bind the working class to national objectives that mask the underlying unity of bourgeois domination. During the Second World War, the party opposed all sides of the conflict, denounced the war as an inter-imperialist struggle in which the working class had no stake, and maintained the line of proletarian defeatism against overwhelming pressure. The union question has always been inseparable from this analysis. In each moment of working class upsurge, in Germany, in Spain, in France, something was waiting to catch the movement and redirect it into a coalition, a democratic front, a ballot box, always in the name of a greater danger that required workers to postpone their own struggle. Fascism was the greater danger. The Republic was worth defending. This is not the moment. These are the oldest words in the arsenal of the counter-revolution, and this party has been answering them for 100 years. Today is no different. The same voices tell workers to postpone their struggle, to unite against the greater threat, to work within the capitalist democratic system. And what does the official left offer to the working class? A mayor who met with Wall Street before taking office and called it a partnership. Regime unions whose response to ICE raids on workers has been statements, and whose response to austerity has been silence. A May Day 2028 general strike initiative that has spent more time on press releases than tearing up no-strike clauses. The capitalist class's assault on the working class does not pause for elections. The safety valve does not become a weapon simply because a friendlier hand holds it. Our party, small, old, and unbothered by either fact, has been saying this for 100 years. This is what we are here for today. 1. May Day. In Chicago, May 1st, 1886, the American labor movement had been asking for the 8-hour day for 50 years by that time, petitioning for it, writing letters about it, passing laws that employers ignored, signing contracts that employers broke. 50 years of this. In 1884, a federation of trade unions took up a call originally issued by the First International. They set a date. From May 1st, 1886, the 8-hour day would be the legal working day, not by the grace of any legislator, but by the direct action of the working class. The largest labor organization in the country, the Knights of Labor, opposed the strike. Their grandmaster, a man named Powderly, told his members to write essays on the 8-hour question instead. Essays. On the occasion of George Washington's birthday, the anarchists called it a compromise with the wage system. The law said it was illegal. The workers struck anyway. 350,000 workers were involved. 30,000 walked out in Chicago alone. Nearly 200,000 won the 8-hour day from that strike. Won it. Not asked for it. Not voted for it. Won it. By walking out and staying out. Then came the reaction. On May 3rd, police shot 4 workers at the McCormick plant. The next night, at a rally at Haymarket Square, someone threw a bomb into the police ranks. To this day, no one knows who. The police opened fire on the crowd and on each other. 7 officers died. An unknown number of workers died. 8 labor organizers were arrested. Not because any of them threw the bomb, but because they had organized the strike. 4 were hanged. A 5th died in his cell. The bomb, the famous anarchist tactic of propaganda of the deed, handed the state everything it needed to effect a large-scale repression on the wider labor movement that took decades to recover. Whatever the intention, the effect was to bury the workers' victory under a discussion of violence and order, and to produce a martyrology that served the anarchist tradition rather than the class. Because while the Haymarket 8 entered the history books, other names did not. In Milwaukee that same week, 6 workers were shot dead in the street by the National Guard on the governor's orders. No famous trial, no monument. They were not anarchists. They were just workers, and they are not remembered because no political current claimed them as its own. Yet the mass strikes leading up to that May Day left the 8-hour workday de facto established across the country. The organization of mass general strike action, even if it faced repression, left a legacy that workers still benefit from today. That is why the 1st of May belongs to the working class. Not to any tendency, not to any flag, to the class. The workers moved. Their leaders told them not to. They moved anyway. They won, and the state killed them for it. And in killing them, revealed what it always was. The armed fist of the class that owns everything against the class that owns nothing. Move forward 33 years. Seattle, February 1919. By then the fire had jumped borders. Russia in 1917, Germany in 1918, red flags from Kiel to Berlin, Hungary's Soviet Republic for 133 days, Italy's 2 red years. For 18 months, the working class of Europe had reason to believe capitalism was ending. In February 1919, the fire reached the Pacific coast. 35,000 shipyard workers walked out. The Seattle Central Labor Council called for a general sympathy strike. On February 6th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, 10,000 organized workers from 110 unions walked off the job at the same moment. The city stopped. It did not descend into chaos. For 5 days, the Seattle working class ran the city. Labor opened 21 dining stations. Labor will feed the people. Labor organized milk delivery. Labor will care for the babies and the sick. Labor formed an unarmed war veterans guard and kept the peace. No one was killed. Almost no one was arrested. The ordinary business of life continued, because the working class, which does the ordinary business of life every single day, continued doing it. They just did it without bosses. For 5 days, Seattle offered a glimpse of what a society run by the working class looks like. Not chaos, not every man at war with every man. Organized, disciplined, collective life. A city that fed its own people, cared for its own babies, kept its own peace, with no mayor, no police captain, no governor, no president. The ruling class saw exactly what it was. The mayor declared the strike a Bolshevik revolution and deputized 2,400 armed men. Federal troops were dispatched to defend, in his words, the Lord of Profit. On February 11th, the strike collapsed. Why? Not because the workers could not sustain it. They had proved hour by hour that they could. The strike was broken by 2 decisive factors working in combination. First, the American Federation of Labor, the regime union of its day, sent telegrams from its international office ordering the workers back to their jobs. This was direct sabotage from the labor bureaucracy. Second, there was no party. No organization capable of saying to the Seattle working class, "You are not just striking for wages. You are part of the same wave that took Petrograd. Hold what you have taken." The local strike committee, isolated and under immense pressure, hesitated. Tactical errors compounded, and without that revolutionary leadership, the strike could not transform into something more. The strike paper had published an editorial on the eve of the general strike. Its title had become famous in American history. No one knows where. The editorial said, in essence, "We are going somewhere. We do not know where, but we are going." That line is often quoted as the romantic soul of Seattle 1919. For this party, it is the diagnosis of the defeat. A class that moves without knowing where is a class that can be stopped. 18 years later, with Seattle's lesson unlearned, Spain. When the fascist generals rose up in July of 1936, the workers of Barcelona and Madrid and Asturias did not wait for the government to save them. They seized the factories, they armed themselves, they organized militias, the bourgeoisie vacated the political scene, the civil guards hid themselves away, and for a moment the proletariat stood as the sole master of the situation. The trams ran on schedules set by the transport workers. The militias formed in the streets and departed for the front. Columns of workers, organized by their own unions, not by any general or minister. Peasants plowed land they'd been told for generations could never be theirs. But the bourgeoisie was not gone. It was regrouping. Our party said this in real time. In the pages of Bilan, while the barricades were still up. The Spanish proletariat, taken up with expropriation, had neglected the essential question: political power. The workers held the streets. The bosses still held the state. That contradiction could only be resolved one way. Then a bourgeois democratic government formed around the workers' conquests. It called itself the Popular Front, and it introduced an idea that has been deployed against the working class ever since: anti-fascism. Not opposition to fascism as such. No communist opposes fascism any less than they oppose any other form of capitalist rule, but anti-fascism as a political program. The demand that the working class subordinate its own struggle, dissolve its own conquests, and line up behind the bourgeois republic, because fascism was the greater danger, and this was not the moment for revolution. Liberals sang this song, Social Democrats sang this song, the Stalinist Communist Party sang this song. The anarchists, who had spent decades rejecting proletarian dictatorship on principle, when the moment came to refuse, did not refuse. They entered the government. Anarchist ministers imposed on the working class the very democratic discipline they had spent decades claiming to oppose. None of them put on the agenda the destruction of the bourgeois republic. They had convinced themselves the republic was a lesser evil, a framework worth defending. It was not a framework. It was the trap. In May 1937, the trap closed. Government troops moved on the telephone exchange in Barcelona, where anarchist workers had been running since July. The workers resisted. A general strike broke out. For 5 days, the same 5 days as Seattle, Barcelona was again in the hands of the armed working class. Then the Popular Front crushed them. With Stalinist troops, with the full support of the democratic government, anarchists, POUM militants, ordinary workers, rounded up, shot, disappeared. Fascism and democracy are not two opposing systems. They are two instruments of the same class deployed according to circumstances. Anti-fascism is the mechanism by which the working class is conscripted into defending one instrument against the other, and in doing so, abandons the fight against both. What died in the streets of Barcelona in May 1937 was not just a revolution. It was the last organized barrier between the European working class and the Second World War. 31 years later, the lesson was taught again. Paris, May 1968. At the Sud Aviation aircraft plant near Nantes, workers locked the manager in his office and occupied the factory. Within days, the occupation spread to Renault, to the chemical plants, to the railways, to the post offices, to the printing houses. By the third week of May, 10 million workers had stopped work. 2/3 of the French working class. The country stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. There was no petrol. The trains did not run. The post did not move. The television went dark. On May 29th, de Gaulle left Paris without telling his own ministers where he was going. He drove to a French military base in Germany to confirm the army would move if necessary. When he returned, his aides said he had considered resigning. The ruling class was shaken. But the state held. The army, the police, the government apparatus, it held and waited. What it was waiting for was the PCF and the CGT, who were already moving to end it. It did not come because the French Communist Party and the CGT had decided it must not come. They had not started this movement. They had not wanted it. And from the moment it erupted, they worked to end it. But even without their sabotage, the movement faced a deeper problem. 10 million workers had stopped work, and when the Grenelle Accords offered wage increases, most of them were prepared to accept. The objective conditions for a prolonged revolutionary struggle were not there. No revolutionary party existed capable of giving the movement direction beyond the immediate. What the PCF and the CGT did was criminal. But the working class, without the leadership of a communist party rooted in the invariant program, and without the deeper crisis that would have made those wage offers insufficient, could be brought back. The regime unions did not have to fight hard to end it. They had to fight just hard enough. Their instrument was the Grenelle Accords, a 35% increase in the minimum wage, wage rises across the board, a reduction in the working week. The CGT leader Georges Seguy drove to the Renault plant in Billancourt, the largest factory in France, the heart of the strike, and presented the agreement to the assembled workers. They shouted him down. The workers of Billancourt did not want a 35% wage increase. They wanted what they had already taken. They were reaching for political power. The CGT went back to the government and said, "The workers have refused, but do not worry, we will handle it." Then came the electoral trap. On May 30th, de Gaulle dissolved the National Assembly and called new elections. The Stalinist Party pivoted immediately. The factories, they told the workers, are not the terrain of politics. Elections are the terrain of politics. Go home. Vote. The workers went home. The factories were evacuated, and in June, de Gaulle won the largest parliamentary majority in the history of the Fifth Republic. The explosion of May produced, by way of the PCF and the CGT, a landslide for the right. 10 million workers on strike, culminating in only a single election. Less than a year later, the French government devalued the franc by 11%. The wage increases of Grenelle were eaten by inflation before the workers had finished spending them. What the state gives through contracts, it takes back through the currency. The physical liquidation of the gains of the movement took a decade, facilitated by the opportunist leadership of the false communist parties and their liquidationist allies in the regime unions. Capital restructured French industry, moved the factories out of the cities, automated the assembly lines, broke up the great concentration of workers that had made the general strike possible. The fortress factories of 1968 were dismantled brick by brick, and the left parties, always in pursuit of electoral respectability, oversaw the process. The same pattern across Western Europe. The left party enters government, governs the dismantling of its own industrial base, and calls it progress. May 1968 is remembered as the revolution that almost happened. For this party, it is something more precise. The clearest demonstration in the history of the advanced capitalist countries of what the official left is actually for. Not to lead the working class to power, to prevent it from getting there, to take the pressure the class has built and release it, safely and permanently, into the ballot box. Haymarket, Seattle, Barcelona, Paris. 4 dates, 1 lesson. The workers move, the official left arrives to contain them. When the workers win, they win because they moved in concerted collective action, out of their class instinct in defense of their living conditions and wages, even against the disorganizing efforts of opportunist regime union leadership. When they lose because the boss-linked leadership of the regime unions lies to them, refuses to organize independently as a class, and channels their energy into the safety valves prepared in advance. That pattern has not changed. It is playing out right now internationally.
In December 2022, American railroad workers rejected their contract. They voted it down. A national strike threatened to stop the supply chains of American capital. The Biden administration invoked the Railway Labor Act. Congress blocked the strike. A self-described pro-labor president, a former union man as Secretary of Labor, a Democratic majority in Congress, and they broke the strike before it began. This is the clearest single demonstration in recent American history of what the official left is actually for. The year that followed saw what people called the hot labor summer of 2023. At UPS, 340,000 Teamsters authorized a strike. The UAW struck the big three automakers. Writers and actors walked the picket line for months. Material conditions had forced workers into defensive action, and the regime union leadership, unable to stop the movement outright, worked instead to contain it. At UPS, the strike threat alone produced a contract, which the Teamsters leadership presented as a victory, while part-time workers, the most exploited section of the workforce, were sacrificed in the settlement. The UAW's rolling strike was designed from the start to limit the spread of action rather than to generalize it. In each case, the pattern was identical, of workers ready to fight, regime unions, leadership counseling and taming workers' obedience to the NLRA framework, cutting deals that undercut the unity of action between sectors and industries that alone could have converted defensive struggle into something the ruling class could not manage. And the regime unions did exactly what they always do. They settled the moment that maximum pressure was applied, declared victory, and immediately pivoted to the 2024 presidential campaign. Sean Fain, the UAW president who had campaigned as the militant alternative to the old guard, stood on a Democratic convention stage less than a year after his own strike. And he told American workers that Kamala Harris was one of them. Trump won. The repression under Trump is not qualitatively new. It is the existing repression made loud and visible. ICE operations conducted quietly under Obama and expanded under Biden are now conducted with press conferences and televised cameras. The workers have been shot in parking lots. One has been run over by an armored vehicle. The raids are designed not only to deport, but to terrorize, to discipline the entire sector of the working class that depends on immigrant labor, drive down its price, remind it of its precarity. This is the capitalist class in profitability crisis. Unable to afford the old allowances, moving to increase the rate of exploitation by whatever means necessary. The regime unions have to answer to this because they are part of the same apparatus. Sean O'Brien stood with Trump at the Republican National Convention. Sean Fain stood with Harris at the Democratic Convention. One endorsed the candidate promising to deport immigrant workers. The other endorsed the candidate who had already broken the railroad strike. Neither was better or worse than the other. Both were doing what the regime union leadership does, aligning with the ruling class faction that offers the best deal for union bureaucracy, while the workers they claim to represent bear the consequences. Against this, the opportunist left has offered statements. The unions issue press releases. Mayors of sanctuary cities hold rallies and invoke the memory of the enslaved and call for general strikes they have no intention of organizing. And then comes Mamdani. 5 million New Yorkers have just voted for a man who calls himself a socialist, who campaigned with the backing of the Democratic Socialists of America, who promised to be a champion of the working class, who promised that this time, finally this time, the municipal institutions of the bourgeois state can be turned against the capitalists and toward the workers. He came through the Democratic Socialists of America. The DSA was, from its foundation until just a few years ago, an official member of the Second International. The same Second International that betrayed the working class in 1914 by voting for war credits and aligning with their national bourgeoisies. That is not incidental. It tells you what the DSA is, the American franchise of international opportunism. Its founding strategy was called realignment, the idea that socialists could not build an independent party and must instead work inside the Democratic Party to push it leftward. Harrington, its founder, was honest enough to describe it himself. He said, "If you're going to play a piano in a whorehouse, you might as well do it with gusto and flair." The problem with this metaphor is that it predicts exactly what happens. The piano player does not transform the whorehouse. The whorehouse has its own logic, its own owners, and its own clientele. Before he took office, Mamdani met with Wall Street. He went to meetings with financial executives, real estate developers, the people who own the city he was about to govern. He assured them, in his own words, that his administration would be a partnership with the business community of New York. He told them that he was not a threat. This is opportunism in plain sight. The rent freeze is the centerpiece of Mamdani's campaign. The policy his supporters hold up as proof that the democratic socialist strategy delivers real gains for the working class. It drove his record-breaking primary turnout, and it is already spreading. Seattle has seen proposals moving in the same direction. Other cities are watching, and what wins in New York becomes the model the DSA points to everywhere else. So it is worth examining carefully. Not to dismiss the material reality of high rent, that reality is brutal, but to ask what a rent freeze actually does to the position of the working class relative to capital. The rent freeze is not a victory for the tenant. The rent freeze is a subsidy for the boss. Marxist analysis of wages is straightforward. Your wage is the price of your labor power. What capital pays to keep you showing up to work tomorrow. What that wage has a floor: food, shelter, clothing, and transportation. If the cost of staying alive goes up, your wage must go up as well. If it goes down, capital pushes the wage down to match, because capital always pushes wages towards the floor. Housing is the single largest component of that floor for most New Yorkers. Why? Oh, for workers. 30, 40, 50% of take-home pay. Freeze the rent, what happens? In the short term, tenants feel real relief. In the medium term, capital adjusts. Wages stop rising. The relationship between wages and the cost of living resets to a newer, lower floor. The worker ends up with the same purchasing power, not more. The rent savings are extracted elsewhere, in wage suppression, in inflation on other goods, in benefits cuts. The accounting changes. The position of the worker relative to the boss does not. This is not theory. This party analyzed it in 1969, drawing on direct Italian experience. The rent freeze in Italy was instituted by Mussolini during wartime. The freeze applied to existing leases. New construction was exempt. Any worker who followed a job to another city lost their frozen contract the moment that they packed the truck. Millions of Southern Italians did during the post-war boom. Everything they owned on the back of a flatbed heading south, and nothing waiting at the other end. Decades later, in the old working-class neighborhoods of Rome and Turin, the frozen leases had become museum pieces. The people holding them were no longer the working class. They were whoever had happened to be sitting in there when the rent freeze went in. Engels answered the housing question 150 years ago. There is no housing shortage, not in New York. Walk through Midtown at midnight and count the dark windows. Floor after floor of investment vehicles dressed as apartments, lights off, no one home. Owned by LLCs registered in the Cayman Islands. The problem is not supply. The problem is that buildings are distributed according to capital's logic, the ability to pay, not according to human need. The communist solution is not a rent freeze. It is expropriation. Take the buildings from their owners and quarter them in every worker who needs a place to live. Mamdani is not going to do that. No mayor can do that. The state exists to protect property. When Mamdani promises a rent freeze, he is promising the administration of housing and justice by a slightly friendlier bureaucracy, financed through a hidden tax on your own wages. The free buses work the same way. The public grocery stores work the same way. Every service the state provides below market cost reduces the floor of what a wage worker needs to survive, which reduces what capital must pay to keep their worker alive. A subsidy to the boss, dressed as a gift to the worker. The worker feels relief. Capital adjusts. The position does not change. Now take this pattern and run it at scale. In 1929, the American economy collapsed. The working class began to move. Sit-down strikes, plant occupations, the class asserting its power against capital at the point of production. With the experience of the Russian Revolution still close to memory, the bourgeoisie in every capitalist country asked the same question. How do we save the system? Two answers emerged. The first was fascism, use the state openly and with violence, outlaw unions, break strikes with troops, restore profitability by terror. Italy, Germany, Spain, and Portugal. The second was the New Deal. But before we get there, the American ruling class was not unfamiliar with terror. The Red Scare after 1917 had already destroyed the IWW, driven the Communist Party underground, and jailed or deported thousands of militants. The American bourgeoisie had used its own version of the club. By 1933, the immediate revolutionary threat had been suppressed, and what remained was an economic crisis that could not be solved by repression alone. The New Deal was the answer to that, a program to restart the basis of capital accumulation through state intervention, stabilize consumption, put the working class back to work producing and purchasing commodities, and prepare the economy and the class itself for the Second Imperialist War. The New Deal was not the opposite of fascism. It was the same response to the same crisis in a different political costume. The Wagner Act of 1935, which legally recognized unions while binding them to federal administration and outlawing strikes outside the framework, and the fascist labor charter are not the opposites. They are cousins. Both recognized unions, both bound to the state. Both traded legal protection for the no strike clause. Both converted the organized working class from a force that could threaten the system into an apparatus for managing it. And here is the fact that reframes everything. The New Deal did not fix the Depression. By 1936, after 4 years of programs, American industrial production was still 13 points below 1929. Unemployment was still above 11 million. A second recession hit in 1937. But what fixed the Depression was the Second World War. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the beloved crown jewel of the New Deal, the public works project liberals still invoke like a prayer, ended up powering the Oak Ridge Atomic Facility, where the uranium for the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was enriched. The cheap TVA hydroelectric power made the atomic bomb possible. The new steel plants, subsidized by the federal government during the Depression, started churning out tanks by 1941. This is what the party means when we say the welfare state and the warfare state are the same apparatus. Roosevelt built one, and it became the other. Butter in 1935, guns in 1941, the same factories, the same workers, the same state. Mamdani is doing the same thing at a municipal scale. He is binding the unions to social movements to his administration. He is administering public services at sub-market rates. He is giving the working class of New York a reason to believe that the Democratic Party is finally, at long last, their party. And when the next crisis comes, which is already arriving, in the form of $36 trillion national debt, a war in Iran that cost $11 billion in its first 6 days, and an apparatus Mamdani will be building will be available for whatever comes next. The pacified city, the docile municipal workforce, the tenants who traded their self-organization for a rent freeze. He is not a bug in the American capitalist system, the international capitalist system. He is a feature of it. Thank you.
3. Class unionism. So, Mamdani is not the road to socialism. The Democratic Party is not the road to socialism. DSA, whatever its members intend, is not the road to socialism. What is? The road to socialism requires the Revolutionary Party, the demolition of the bourgeois state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But the working class cannot wage that offensive struggle without first organizing its defensive struggles, and that means class unionism. This is not a slogan, it means something specific, not a rhetorical commitment to militancy, not a preference for more aggressive union leadership, but a form of labor organization that the global capitalist class has spent 100 years systematically destroying, and that the working class must rebuild in order to fight effectively at all. There are two kinds of unions, class unions and regime unions. The distinction is not about attitude, it is structural. A class union is an organization of workers that defends the material conditions of the working class against capital and the state, without subordinating that defense to the legal order, the national interest, or the electoral cycle. It fights on the terrain of wages, hours, and conditions, using the only weapon that actually threatens capital, the withdrawal of labor power. A class union does not sign no-strike clauses. A class union does not endorse candidates. A class union does not beg the NLRB for recognition. A class union exists to fight. A regime union is something else. A regime union is a bureaucracy that sits between the workers and the employer, managing the relationship, collecting dues, signing contracts, running elections, endorsing Democrats. The Service Employees International Union, the American Federation of Teachers, the United Auto Workers, the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. These are regime unions. This is not an insult, it is a description of what they have become. Not because their members are passive or their better leaders are insincere, but because their organizational existence depends on compliance within a legal framework designed by and for the ruling class. They are not authentic defensive organs of the working class, but the HR firms of the bosses, designed to contain the working class fighting for itself on its own grounds, hamstringing it so it is defenseless against its ruthless class enemy. This is what the boss-linked leadership of the established unions ensure the established unions remain. The unions that exist today came out of real struggle. Flint, Seattle, Minneapolis. The maritime workers who organized across lines of race and skill in the 1930s. These were organizations that actually fought. What happened to them is often taught as a victory. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 forced employers to recognize unions and bargain with them. But recognition came with conditions. Mandatory arbitration, no strike clauses during contract periods, prohibition on sympathy strikes, certification procedures that tied the union's existence to state recognition. Legality meant survival. Survival meant compliance. The model, workers, employers, and the state negotiating within a legal framework for the good of the nation, was not an American invention. It was perfected in fascist Italy in 1927 under Mussolini's labor charter. The principle? Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Every capitalist government on earth adopted some version within 20 years. Roosevelt's version came with a different flag and without the open terror against the left. The terror against the left came separately, through the Red Scare, which expelled the communists and militants who had built the most combative sections of the labor movement and who understood most clearly what had happened to it. The post-war economic boom completed the work. American imperial dominance of the global economy raised wages and expanded social programs just enough to make collaboration look like common sense. The belly was filled and the fist unclenched. Which brings us to May Day 2028. Let us be direct. This party supports the call for a general strike. We support it without reservation. The American working class has not flexed its muscles as a class in living memory. The accumulated anger over wages, housing, healthcare, working conditions, immigration terror, all of it demands an outlet proportionate to what is being done to workers. A general strike is the appropriate response. We call on the working class to make it a reality. But we have to be honest about what is actually being organized under that banner, what its limitations are, and what it would take to make it into the thing its name promises. The origin of 2028 matters. Coming off the UAW stand-up strike, Shawn Fain called for unions to align their contract expiration dates around May 1st, 2028, so that workers across multiple industries would be at the table simultaneously and could coordinate action. Fain has been clear, this is a contract alignment strategy, not a call for a general strike. Aligning contracts is legal. A general strike, under American law, is not. Fain drew that line himself. What happened next is that the energy around the idea, the genuine hunger in the labor movement for something bigger, got picked up by the organizations promoting May Day Strong, which has marketed it as a general strike. The rhetoric has run well ahead of the organizational reality. Fain came to power in the UAW through a federal government-supervised election after corruption scandals gutted the previous leadership. His presidency is a product of state intervention in the union, not rank-and-file insurgency from below. The stand-up strike was deliberately designed to limit the spread of action. Small groups of workers out at a time, carefully managed to prevent the kind of generalized strike that would have actually threatened the Big Three. The contract gains were real but narrow, and the rolling structure of the strike was engineered to contain rather than develop the fighting capacity of the class. Fain has since endorsed the tariff as a tool for rebuilding American manufacturing, which is to say, rebuilding the war economy, and has described strikes at Lockheed Martin and Pratt & Whitney as part of America's arsenal of democracy. A UAW president who frames the defense industry as a jobs program for workers is not a militant. He is a recruiting sergeant for the next imperialist war. As of now, only a limited number of unions have actually aligned their contracts. The majority of labor contracts will expire past May of 2028. 90% of American workers have no contracts at all, meaning the legal framework of the initiative structurally excludes the majority of the working class from the start. More telling is the political language being used. Read what is being written about 2028 in the labor press. The focus is not on working class power, it is on blocking the Republican Party, defending democratic institutions, meaning the bourgeois state, building coalitions with progressive candidates, meaning Democrats. This is not the language of class struggle, this is the language of the Democratic Party. Labor Notes, one of the most widely read left publications in the American labor movement, has defined this potential general strike as a civic shutdown that includes, in their own words, support of local governments, churches, media institutions, professional associations, and even some businesses. A strike that includes businesses is not a strike. A strike that includes local governments is not a strike. What is being built, if this current wins 2028, is a mass electoral mobilization with strike aesthetics. That is what boss-linked leadership does to a movement that has real power. It manages the power until the power dissipates. This party's call to the working class is this: do not let that happen to 2028. If workers go on strike on May Day 2028, they will be real workers with real grievances. The contract concessions some of them win will be real. Workers must fight for those gains, for wage increases, for the reduction of working hours and the length of the working day, for raising the pay of the most exploited workers. And the party fights alongside them for these demands. But we must fight simultaneously, inside and outside the established unions, within class unionist formations, protest in the assemblies and union meetings, fight to organize new unions on class struggle lines and in the rank and file, to push back against the boss-linked and Democratic Party-aligned leadership in the unions that is trying to turn this moment into an electoral campaign. Fight for class demands, wages, hours, the shortening of the working week without reduction in pay. Fight to extend the strike beyond the legal framework of contract expiration to the workers, the majority, who have no contracts and cannot wait for them. Fight for the strike to be what its name says it is. The working class must flex its muscles. The question is what direction those muscles move in when they flex. The American working class has done this before, and it did not do it through the official union structure. In 1934, Minneapolis Teamsters fought a general strike that won the right to organize the entire trucking industry of the Midwest. Not through legal certification, but through direct action that the official union establishment opposed and tried to settle on inferior terms. That same year, the ILWU waterfront strike shut down the entire West Coast for 83 days. Rank-and-file militants built solidarity across craft lines and refused every attempt to settle before their objectives were met. In both cases, what made the difference was workers organizing outside the legal permission structure, because that permission structure is designed to prevent exactly the kind of action that threatens capital. A class union operates on that terrain. Not necessarily outside the existing unions, but outside the framework of legality and contract compliance that constrains the regime union's capacity to fight. This is the work the party is doing now. In the United States, our militants participate in the Class Struggle Action Network, an inter-union coordination across multiple unions and political tendencies. Through CSAN, an immigrant worker defense resolution has passed in the American Postal Workers Union, in IBEW locals in Richmond and Portland, in the SEIU, and in the Teamsters, with organizing underway in 15 additional unions. This is not symbolic agitation, it is a concrete challenge, carried through official union channels, to the business unionism that tells workers their union is not the place to address the repressive apparatus capital uses to keep the most exploited section of the working class in permanent vulnerability. A party comrade brought the May Day 2028 resolution to a 500-delegate Oregon Educators' Assembly and lost by 2 votes, 244 to 242. That is not a defeat, that is a measurement of where the working class is and what the next fight looks like. Our comrades are in UFCW locals right now, building a class struggle committee. They had also been involved in an effort to build a national caucus of 31 workers to put forth organizing around class demands. Worker leaders in various locals across the country who are critical of their union's relationship with the Democratic Party. Every time that committee makes progress towards genuine class organization, DSA members show up to redirect the work toward the ballot box. Not because those DSA members are agents or conspirators, because the organizational logic of DSA is opportunist. It seduces workers with the promise of easy electoral gains and redirects them away from real class struggle into the bourgeois democratic machine. The mechanism by which Democratic Party work produces working class power has never been identified in 50 years of DSA history because it does not exist. 3 of our comrades have lost their jobs in the past year for organizing in their workplaces. They were fired. They are looking for new work. That is what class work actually looks like. Not a press release, not a primary campaign, workers putting their livelihoods on the line to build something that does not yet have a name most people would recognize, in places most people have never heard of, because that is where the class actually is. Within the class, we advocate for demands of higher wages, shorter hours, better conditions. Workers win these gains through struggle, and they matter. But we reject reformism, the idea that capitalism can be reformed into a stable system of interclass harmony, that revolution can be avoided through a ladder of partial conquests. The entire mainstream left operates on that reformist premise. Their theory is that the working class can accumulate gains within capitalism, build power through gradual reforms and electoralist tactics within the capitalist state machinery, move the terrain steadily leftward until, somehow, eventually, we arrive at socialism. But history shows otherwise. Capitalism does not evolve peacefully into socialism. It must be overthrown. After 150 years of watching this strategy fail on 6 continents, our analysis is that the latter is a treadmill. Every gain is conditional on the profitability of the system that grants it. Every gain is taken back when the next crisis forces capital to reset. The New Deal was dismantled, the Great Society was dismantled, and the ladder climbers are on the same rungs for the 3rd and 4th time, each time insisting this moment is different, this candidate is different. The American working class in 2026 is weaker than it has been at any point in living memory. Union density under 10%, no revolutionary situation, no pre-revolutionary situation. What there is a crisis deepening in ways that cannot be managed indefinitely. A $36 trillion national debt. A war that started and was paused without explanation. Masked federal agents in unmarked vehicles. Austerity being prepared so that the working class will pay for the war machine. The ruling class is lurching, too arrogant to hide what it is doing, too decayed to do it with the old competence. The working class senses something is wrong. It has not yet been told the full truth about what that something is. When it is, there will be 2 possibilities. The first is that it finds only the absorption apparatus, regime unions, DSA politicians, labor-left media, all aligned to direct the energy toward 2028, or the election after that. The second is that it finds, alongside the safety valves, a party with a program, a party with a 100-year analysis of exactly how they will try to stop it and what must be done to win. The International Communist Party, the sole defender of orthodox revolutionary Marxism, the doctrine of the working class's final objective aims, its emancipation, and the elevation of humanity out of class society and toward communism, is that party. We are small. We have always been small. We operate as compact group, as Lenin once used the term for the party. We publish a newspaper. We hold meetings. We do union work. We are present on picket lines in Albuquerque, in educators' assemblies in Oregon, in union halls in Richmond and Chicago, and on picket lines at Genoa and Izmir, and wherever else in the world the class struggle is being carried on. We are not asking permission from the agents of the bourgeois state. We are not waiting for the right election. We are not building toward a break that requires conditions that never fully arrive. Haymarket, Seattle, Barcelona, Paris. The workers who moved, who won when they moved in organized collective action on class ground, and who lost when the regime unions and false communist parties channeled that movement into the ballot box, the negotiating table, and the Democratic Front. In every case, the decisive factor was the same. The absence of a revolutionary party capable of telling the working class the truth about its situation and giving its combativity the direction it needed. Our task is to be present in the class, on the picket lines, in the union halls, in the strike committees, as an organized revolutionary force, fighting to win workers to the class union independent of the state, independent of the bosses, bound to no strike clause and no electoral cycle. The party and the class union are not separate projects. They are two expressions of the same historical necessity. Neither is sufficient without the other. We have kept that program alive because history is not finished with us, and the class is not finished with its task. The capitalist class's state is not on your side. The Democratic Party is not on your side. The rent freeze is a subsidy for the boss. And the May Day 2028 mobilization, as constituted by the DSA and the regime union leadership, is the safety valve being built in advance of the pressure it is meant to release. But if workers strike, we will be on the picket line. We have always been on the picket line. Our criticism is not of workers who fight. It is of the leadership that takes that fight and points it at a ballot box. These are the lessons of 150 years of working class struggle, defended by this party through every phase of the counter-revolution, and as necessary today as the day they were first drawn.